you say that he wanted there to be more rhyme in this book, but I also like he kept talking about the rhyme like he was like a little child from like the Dust Bowl, and he'd never see. He's like, "Golly, Mister, I'd never seen so many rhymes before." Just like calm down, dude. Like they're just this is not it's not that remarkable. These are just rhyming poems. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who have had a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to a friend. That is the way in which people hear about it. This is pretty much the only way. So you are doing your part, and I am grateful. Thanks also if you are subscribed to The Secret Show. Go ahead and subscribe. I'll just say, go ahead and subscribe. It is a good show. It is funny, I think, and entertaining, and it's pretty fucking cheap. Also, a lot of you are listening and not subscribing somehow because I'm bad at the internet and you figured out a way around the paywall. And, you know, that's fine. And particularly if you are, if money is a big problem for you, do write me. And, some people have, and I will work something out with you. I'm happy to work something out with you. I don't want simply like the inability to pay to be a reason you're not listening. But if you can pay a little bit of money, it's that's how the show gets made. That's what pays for our annual internet fees and podcasting equipment and even just books and shit we got to read. The ones they don't. We're not yet a big enough deal. I started getting like books. I've started to get like publishers have started reaching out and magazines and things sometimes send me stuff. But I'm mostly just buying shit for all of us to read. So please do support the show if you are able to do so. Subscribe to The Secret Show. Go to sleeverickets.substack.com. You will get, I think now you're able to give a free 1 month's membership as a gift to a friend, just no strings attached, they just get access for a month. I think you should be able to do like 1 or 2 of those, or maybe even more. I think you may have to wait like every 6 months. You can do another little parcel of them, but that's a draw. Also, if you are already subscribing, like take advantage of that. Like go ahead and give a membership out to a couple people. In addition to that, if you are a Secret Show subscriber, send me a note and I will send you free stickers. They are really nice stickers. They have the show logo in a bunch of different colors, and I'll just mail them to you because I love you, and that's it. Also, so Substack devised this little chat program. We've been real lazy about it, but a handful of people signed up, and they are now able to do it on Android. At first, it was only for iPhone users. So if I can get a few people on there, then it might actually be worth having kind of a conversation. And that's just like it would be. Basically, it's a little private thread only for people who listen to the show and subscribe to The Secret Show. And then Cameron and Brian and me. And Alice, if she ever feels like joining on there, which she probably is too wise to do so. It's like a little private phone thread for us to yell at each other in a new format. So sign up for The Secret Show. If you just put your email address in, you can get access to all of the episodes on there for a week for free without putting down any payment information. And then go ahead and sign up. Because it's pretty fucking good, I think. And it is a pretty good deal. So I don't want to give you too hard a sell, but I will give you a medium sell. Do go ahead. If you've been thinking about it, if you've been waiting, go ahead and sign up for The Secret Show. And this is a good time to, if you're going to do the annual version, definitely do that now before the new year. Because it will get a little bit more expensive. It'll still be very cheap, but it'll just be slightly less shockingly cheap after the new year. All right, enough. I was never a good salesman. I sold clothes. I've tried to sell a couple of. I've never been a good salesman. But I do actually, I don't have any, like, this is actually a product I don't have anything dishonest to say about. Brian has said, like, I would probably be like a better person overall if I were a little bit better at this kind of thing. But I'm just not. So enough of that bullshit. Do go to sleerickets.substack.com. And if you have any questions about any of this shit, write me at sleerickets@gmail.com. This week, I have a very fun conversation with Jonathan Farmer. We got the new Best American Poetry, edited by David Lehman and guest edited this year by Matthew Zapruder. A thoughtful, responsible, sober-minded poetry podcast would spend a lot of time reading the poems selected and talking about their virtues and maybe coming up with a short list best of the best of. Instead, Jonathan and I just made fun of the introductory essays. We do talk a little bit about some specific poems, but mostly we just make fun of David Lehman and Matthew Zapruder, and I had a lot of fun. Jonathan also talked some about his experience in writing criticism and being sort of his own personal demonstration of the non-existence of a genuine meritocracy in the poetry world. And we also had a fairly long and juicy debate about the value of political poetry, which I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much either of us was radically changed by that conversation, but it did open up some new possibilities I'd not thought about, as well as we also talked about Jonathan's complaint about how maybe all formal poetry is just light verse. He didn't put it quite in such simplistic terms, but we did talk a little bit about some beefs with formal poetry, a small preview in a way of an upcoming episode in which Cameron tries to take down the entire new formalist movement in an episode. But this is I think, very fun, very silly conversation with Jonathan Farmer. He was on a previous episode. That's a lot of fun as well. He is kind of my poetry big brother. He's one of the few poets who lives in this area. I mean, really now, there are a lot of poets who live in this area. There aren't many that I'm friends with. And he's among the very, very few that I am friends with. And I like also, both his prose and his poetry as well. So this is, I think, a fun and very silly conversation that you will enjoy, unless, as I mentioned on The Secret Show, you are my dad and you are hoping I won't burn any more bridges. In that case, you probably want to stop listening now. I don't know whether, because I feel like, so David Lehman does a little forward, which typically is, forward is typically very short, and then an introduction is way longer. The forward is longer than the introduction. So the forward is David Lehman. The introduction is Matthew Zapruder. I read an intensely passive-aggressive relationship into these two documents, at least into the Lehman one.
The Lehman one is weird. It kind of spends a long time describing poems he would have chosen if he was the editor.
He starts with this note that that caught my attention. So he says, years ago, the rumor circulated that secretly it was I who picked the poems for the annual Best American Poetry. Perhaps I should have felt flattered. Did I really wield so much power and influence? Did anyone seriously believe that I could dictate to Charles Simic, Adrian Rich, John Hollander, Rita Dove, Robert Creeley et al.? On the face of it, the notion was absurd. The guest editor chooses the poems. His or her autonomy is guaranteed as a ground condition, and we go to pains to emphasize this fact. So, had you ever heard this rumor? Or had you ever had this thought? No?
No.
I did, but I heard a very specific version of it. And I was up in the air about whether or not to believe it. This totally makes me believe. Like, this so much more makes me believe it than having heard it in the first. So what I heard was that basically he chooses half. That, like, effectively he curates kind of the, like, out of these things, and then he basically reserves roughly half for, like, his stable of people. and I heard this. I'm not gonna say this on the show, but I will tell you where I heard it from, and I just want to hear your reaction, so you can
Uh-huh.
gauge like how reliable this source should be. So what I heard
Okay.
was
I mean,
that's the reliability of the source.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I can imagine maybe like I don't think like because I mean the one thing this reveals is that like he has a specific Layman has a specific taste in poetry. What I took from this is he's maybe fine with the poems that are being selected, but he's frustrated that the kind of stuff he likes just has no representation there. None of the stuff that he really likes the best. And so he decided to have an entire forward, well, not entire forward, like this lengthy forward, much of which is just him talking about poems that were published this year that he would have included,
yeah,
which are very, good or bad, very unfashionable poems.
yes.
Like poems that
The
most people he would choose as a guest editor right now would not even think of including.
Right. Though they were all, well, I don't know Terry Ellen Cross Davis or Angela Ball, but at least the first three he named were, well, one was a posthumous poem by Nabokov, and then Mary Jo Salter and Rachel Hoddes, and both of them have been in the
Mm-hmm.
Best American Poetry in the past.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I was. This is a weird. The forward is divided into three parts. The first part, as you said, is him insisting that he does not pick the poems that go into the Best American Poetry, and then listing all these poems he wishes had been in there instead. The middle section is a
Then there's the
yeah,
transition, right? So he,
yeah,
he
yeah.
goes through this
Oh,
kind
the
of
transition. Oh
just
my God, yeah, the transition.
pretty aimless just description of poems he liked, all of
Yeah,
which I think have, or most of which I think have some pretty strong stylistic
yeah.
similarities. Um,
Three of
and
them are
then
very
and
metrical and rhyming. Like just
yes,
the first three. Yeah,
mhm. And
and
like
then that transition is.
yeah, and then he says, also I would have chosen a poem by Matthew Zapruder.
He says
Uh,
I feel like his phrasing gets so careful in this section. He says, "If I were the guest editor of this volume, I would
mhm,
also pick something by Matthew Zapruder."
yeah,
Which is not to say I love Matthew Zapruder's poetry. It's saying like I would have selected something from the name Matthew Zapruder. And then even when he comes as close as he comes to saying I like Matthew Zapruder's poems, still very carefully worded. He says,
well, so
I
go
was
ahead.
immediately taken by his enthusiasm and by the quality of his poems. Which isn't to say which quality it is, but it is very. I mean, I think it is meant to say that he admires him, but that is literally as close as he comes to actually saying the poems are good, and then he goes out of his way to let somebody else praise his poems without
Yeah,
ever himself praising any particular book or poem by Matthew Zapruder.
yeah. I think you're overstating the case a little bit. I think he does say some positive things about the one of the Zapruder poems himself. Uh,
I don't know if he does.
yeah, I may
I
be
think it's all
misremembering,
Amy. I think it's
but
all
yeah,
Amy
but
Gersler.
you yeah, yeah,
I
but yeah,
think it's all Amy
he just
Gersler.
gives a lot of time to letting somebody else
He quotes a lot of other people saying nice things
praise
about him,
this.
or just naming prizes that
Yeah.
he's been included in or things. And then he gives over like a big chunk to Amy, a big like a page or so of this introduction to Amy Gersler, saying like I wrote Amy Gersler asking her to write an appreciation of Matthew Zapruder's poems, and
Oh yeah,
she
you're right. You're right.
yeah
The quotation is longer than I realized. Like I had read
yeah
some part down
no
here. I
no
was like,
that's
oh no,
all Amy
that's
Gersler.
pretty. Yeah. It go,
It's all Amy Gersler. He just says Amy says this about this particular poem of his, and she's like, it's a perfectly nice and clear enough note that she wrote, but it's
yeah,
clearly like
yeah,
an email she wrote him. I mean, like, oh, okay, I guess I'll here's
yeah.
Matthew Zapruder. It is. I am underwhelmed by this poem. It's a poem that is very. The subject matter is very grave and moving. I think it's a very, very mediocre poem on a very intense subject. But
Mhm. I mean, all I read is the little bit of quotation that they have in here, and I like the little bit that's in here. I'm more taken with um, a sort of conversational style that can move pretty easily across lines and across ideas and situations without a lot of jump cutting and some of those other techniques that are fashionable in certain kinds of poetry right now.
I mean, I think it reads
Yeah,
kind of like a social media post. Like it's emotional, but it's as forthcoming as like the like slightly self-deprecating mode that people use when they're rambling artfully on social media. Like that's what it really feels like to me. And again, like the subject matter is so close to home and so intense, and it sounds like he's a really wonderful husband and father. But I'm totally. I mean, this is the one poem held up to say what a guy, and I just think it's really really lukewarm. But this is all given over
yeah,
to Amy Gershler
yeah.
to praise, and then the end of his foreword is just also two guest editors in the past died this year, and they were great. And here's why Robert Bly was great. And then here's a very long quotation from David Wagner.
I mean, one way of reading what he's up to here, and the whole thing's a little clumsy, is that he sees his guest editors as a kind of pantheon, and that he is sort of welcoming Zapruder into that pantheon. The second section is sort of about Matthew Zapruder, but it's really about the great history of people who have guessed this august, highly commercial anthology. So he starts listing all of these big names from the past who were guest editors. That's in the very first paragraph, and then he does say, I learned Amy Gershler, who made the choices for BAP 2010,
Yeah.
about Zapruder's work. So I think he does nod towards
He nods
Amy
at
Gershler.
Zapruder's work having been recognized much, but he's pretty. I mean, I also like setting aside the question of David Lehman and Matthew Zapruder specifically. Here's a broader hypothetical for you. If you are editing a series where every single year you have a new guest editor, what kind of pantheon can you include all of them in? Because he doesn't repeat people. I mean, I don't think
Right. It's
so.
the it's it's
It's the
it's the
pantheon of what,
pantheon of
though?
his book. It's the pantheon of his
It's
book.
just his book. His book is the that's
He's
the
he's
status.
he's burnishing the book. He's
So,
burnishing
oh
the
yeah,
series.
definitely. I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, which also like, I mean, there's something. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if he's like winking or wincing when he says, "Did I really wield so much power and influence?" Like, fucking, what are you talking about, man? Come on. But I'm just curious. Like, I would have a hell of a time picking an authoritative guest editor every year for the best American poet. Like, there aren't that many poets I admire who are alive. Like it, I mean, it just seems, I don't know, like how, like it would be, which is not to say anything bad about him or about Zapruder, but like it would be impossible for you to think all of these people were especially qualified for this, wouldn't it? I mean, unless
I
you
don't
like you
know.
have like a
I
fundamental egalitarianism to your view of like what makes poetry good.
I just I think he's a poetry evangelist.
There's a poetry
He's
evangelist.
and he believes in poetry as a cause. I mean, I know nothing about this guy. I'm just
Yeah, yeah.
making assumptions. But I mean, how do you justify publishing a book every year called The Best American Poetry, which is it's a nonsense idea. Almost nobody you could pick to be guest editor at this point who is prominent enough to do it would even believe in the concept
Right,
of
right.
a single person selecting the best. Like I almost imagine at this point he has to beg people not to write several paragraphs in their introduction about how they don't believe in the idea of a best.
I mean, and
Um,
to Zapruder's credit, he does say like, "What is this toilet paper for you to wipe your ass with during the apocalypse or something like
yeah,
I mean, he really says like this book is kindling. He says like this means nothing. I mean, all of it says like this all like not just this particular endeavor is a waste, but like all of Western literature is in vain.
which is his feint to set up something that's not about the book but about poetry. A
Yeah,
statement that's
yeah.
the exact opposite, which is that poetry is the only thing that can save us from fascism.
Oh God,
Um,
yeah, 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 yeah. Well,
uh,
we'll
but
get
we can
into
get to
that,
that.
but yeah, I mean, I think if you're gonna do best American poetry, I think like you need to have. I think it's like there's too much and not enough hubris. Like you need to just have the hubris to say like I'm picking it. I mean, if he were doing that, he wouldn't be. It wouldn't have the. It doesn't. It wouldn't have the reach and the influence it
Right,
does.
right.
But it's so it's
All
this
of
weird
this,
compromise.
yeah, all of this
You could almost say it's like
is
a
like
50-50 compromise where he does. Yeah,
no, but all of this is presumably just about creating an audience, right? Creating an
yeah,
audience
yeah,
of people who will
yeah,
buy a book. If it was the same editor every year, people wouldn't buy it. If it was called anything other than the Best American, you would have no way of marketing it.
yeah. Right.
Like, even though I assume none of his editors actually agree, his guest editors at this point agree. I'm sure Harold Bloom believed that he was picking the best, however many poems from that year.
Yeah, yeah,
But like almost anybody he's picking at this point doesn't believe that. I don't believe it.
right. Yeah,
If I were the guest editor, I would feel like it was nonsense. I cannot conceive of any other title you could give this book where it would be of any note. Like,
oh yeah, yeah.
anything that nods to what this actually is. Like, one person picks out a bunch of poems they like that were published that year. Like,
Right.
there's no marketing genius without pretending this is a contest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Could make anything of this. And so it seems like all of this is this weird, like, hybrid commercial evangelical project. And I have a hunch that he genuinely believes in that. He believes in poetry as a cause, and this is a way of selling, literally and figuratively, of selling poetry.
I don't know. It just feels like there's like I want him to be all the way cynical or like all the way earnest, and it just feels like it's neither nor. So Zapruder's introduction, which he squeaks in at like it's barely 7 pages. Like it technically counts as 7 pages. Like if you were like turning in an essay to a teacher and he would say like, well, it's 7. I reached 7 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 and a fifth of a page. It with that big old healthy indentation on the first page, so that saves them some space. I was entertained by this, but sort of baffled. Like there are things in it that I agree with, but it feels like other than this weird peroration he gets to at the end, with as you said, like poetry is the tool with which we can defeat fascism. It seems like he sort of can't commit to anything.
Yeah.
It seems like he's like nervously tap dancing the whole time.
Yeah. It's well, it just so let me back up. I want to just give a couple of disclaimers here.
Sure.
One is that it's a ridiculous project that I could not do well.
Yeah.
So like the implicit question you're supposed to be answering here is what do you mean by best? Best
Yeah. Yeah.
for what? Best of what? Like, best at what? And it's a question that I doubt he believes he has an answer to. Which kudos to him. I wouldn't buy an answer that really took seriously the idea of best.
I just for whatever it's worth, because I was working with Brian recently on a forward and an introduction specifically, and looking at those, I was like looking up like fundamentally what those words do or what those conventions are. And the foreword is written by someone who's not the author or the main editor, and the function of the foreword is to say why should you read this book, and the function of the introduction is to say what are you about to read. And I would say that neither of them performs those functions. Like neither of like Lehman's foreword doesn't tell you why you should read the book, and Zapruder's introduction doesn't tell you what you're going to read.
I mean, in the sense that he gives a couple of descriptions of a couple of poems, I guess it does. But yeah, like I don't think he wants to set out, and again, I don't hold this against him. I don't think he wants to set out a definition of what he thinks makes a poem good or bad. I don't think he wants to set
Oh,
out a standard of quality, which is what you really doing. You're
right.
saying this stuff is better than the other stuff because X, and
Yeah.
like that's that. I mean, that is the promise of this book. This stuff is better than the other stuff. Nobody believes, but that's the promise of the book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But,
Um,
but even other
and
editors in the past have said things like, "I can't say these are the best, but these are the ones that like caught my fancy. These are the ones that
yeah,
tickled me. These are the ones that moved me." And I don't know that he even says that. Like he seems
he
not even
he
to want
does.
to
He
commit to
does.
that.
Yeah, these are the
Oh,
poems
yeah.
that
The imagination of these
leave
poems
him
took me
more.
again and again to places where I could feel again. So he says that he was numb,
Yeah,
and reading these were the poems that made him feel again. So I guess that, yeah,
yeah,
there we go.
and he says more broadly, about poems he loves in general. Now I'm more alive and aware. I feel sadder, more vulnerable, more capable of resisting. So that
I want to get back to that
these,
question because that's a
yeah,
weird
yeah,
fucking point.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Uh,
ridiculous task, but also if you take the job and you get paid for it, then it's okay to make fun of you. Is my
yeah,
thought. Like it's an
yeah.
absurd
That
task, and you do it in public, and this is here you are.
Yeah, fair enough. The other disclaimer I want to say is that I I have a weird mixture of self-recognition and agitation when I read this, because I think, I've got this sort of like weird set of experiences in the poetry world where I
Yeah.
sort of, at a time when I wasn't
Do you want to just
really.
tell people a little bit about that because they may not all know your
Yeah,
background. Yeah.
yeah. So, basically at a time when I wasn't super into poetry, this just ridiculous opportunity fell in my lap. And it fell in my lap because I was friends with someone who had influence. So I got to be Slate's poetry critic for like 4 years with no qualifications for the role, none. Like, didn't have any experience as a critic. It's just that I have a lovely friend who is an editor at Slate, who likes to do nice things for his friends. And I benefited from that. But so all of a sudden, like, poetry got really exciting for me. Like this thing that I'd kind of faded away from for various reasons. All of a sudden, I was really excited about, and it changed the way I felt about the poems I read. It
Yeah.
made them more interesting to me. But also, like, I could look on social media and see like people were reading this thing I wrote. Like, you could
Yeah. Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
see. They used to have this thing where it would show you like how many times something had, an article had been tweeted and how many times it had been posted
Right.
on
Right.
Facebook, and I could see that.
And you were doing
It
like
was really
a review every how often?
a review every other month.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So for I think almost exactly 4 years, I was doing that.
And you were
You
reading
know,
a
there
ton of
there
books. Like you read and you received like even like a flood of books.
I
I mean,
received a
I
ton. I
I know because
read.
I saw a lot of them when you would like when you would like when like the new books that you had not touched or that you'd read once and passed off that then would turn up at the bookstore because they had a good used section. And that was
Yeah,
they had the like new pristine section, which was just the Jonathan Farmer section.
yeah, yeah. And, in a lot of cases, I would just read a little bit of a book and
Mhm.
quickly say, okay, I'm not that interested in this. I full-time job as a teacher. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I wasn't going to read everything. If I read a few poems and it didn't do anything for me, I was fine putting it aside.
yeah.
But I got really caught up in it, and a lot of what I wrote, like, I still feel pretty good about. But also, there's this note of boosterism
Mhm.
I can hear in a lot of that. I got really caught up in playing to my audience without even knowing I was doing it. Like, I really didn't know I was doing it.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's familiar. I think like a lot of people
yeah.
who have to talk about poetry in any given context to feel that like how am I gonna how do I put a brave face on this? How do I make this sound good? How do like and I don't think it comes from a disingenuous impulse. I
No,
think it
I mean,
yeah
I legitimately like the books about it. I made a point, with one exception. I made a point of just writing about books I like. That was what I was asked to do.
yeah
I praise them in terms that I believe, but I think I was always, even though I have some skepticism about poetry, as a unit, as a cause, I I think I wanted to, like, get people excited about what I was writing, and then I would do that, and it would go into the world, and you could see people being excited about it. I think that very much shaped the way I wrote as well as the way I read, and there's a part of that that just bugs me in retrospect. Not that I liked then, I think, more things than I like now, because they were part of this kind of
yeah
community and
yeah yeah
culture and activity. I don't feel bad about that, but some of the high notes that I was hitting, like, I feel like I would just get carried away.
yeah 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 yeah.
Um, and I feel like that happens to Zapruder some in this essay. Like, I feel like he just gets carried, like he can imagine his audience well enough that he kind of can't stop flattering them.
It's funny because I think I know what you're talking about, and I both like have experienced that as a reviewer and And I even think back to, like, particularly as an undergrad, the kind of excitement I would feel reading poems that when I go back to them, it feels like there's almost nothing there. It was not a false excitement, but it's hard to pin down, like there's something about a very charged context that can make a few sort of flimsy words on a page generate electricity, or at least conduct electricity in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. This introduction doesn't, to me, feel like he gets happy about poetry. It doesn't feel like he gets swept away by the poetry in this. It feels like he gets swept away by his own, like, his own rhetoric or his own
Yeah, yeah,
maneuvers.
that's that. I mean, but I think that's what I did sometimes too, where I was like hitting these notes that I just knew would ring out with my audience, and like I just kept hitting the bells harder and harder. Like, yeah, you're right. I don't think he's typically very excited about the poetry here, but he gets very carried away talking about poetry. Um,
Yeah,
Poetry becomes a
it's
cause for him
it's
here.
and it
So
feels to me
that's
almost like the opposite of the Stephanie Burt thesis, right? Because
yes,
her book was called "Don't Read Poetry,"
yes.
and
And then the
right.
subtitle is How to Read Poems.
Yeah, it was like, forget about the big abstract category, worry about the
Right.
individual poems, and he seems to be doing
Yeah.
the exact opposite of that here.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
And I think that's one of the few things that his intro has in common with Layman's forward, which is that Layman gets carried away as well. What does he say? Something he's talking about, I think, the Rachel Hoddes poem
mhm. Oh yeah,
that's
you wanted to talk about
talking
these
about.
two poems.
Yeah, and we can come back to them. But I just want
Okay.
to say what he says about this poem talking about Zoom
Yeah.
that's in.
Yeah, sorry, your audio cut for a second. She does a
Oh,
poem about teaching on Zoom called
oh,
"In the Cloud." It was in the New Yorker.
yeah, and he says that he's ecstatic about the fact that she's writing about this contemporary experience
Yeah,
and
yeah,
doing it in regular meter and a regular rhyme scheme. And he says to confront the new with with one of poetry's most traditional devices, rhyme is a daring move.
he
I'm like,
can't
no, it's
talk
not.
enough about
It's
how these
not.
poems rhyme. He's like Nabokov's
Right.
scrupulously rhymed poems. It's like, well, that's another
Yeah.
way of saying
No. I
rhymed. Like, they just
I
fucking
I
rhyme.
I, I I think one. I think part of his frustration is really that there's just no. It's not just that there's no meter and rhyme in here, presumably,
Yeah.
but that's one of the things that I think really grates at him. Like I think he's tired of nobody including formal poetry. But
Which
then
to be fair,
you get
Dana Joy included lots of when he edited a few years ago. Um,
yeah. But I mean,
but yeah, as a
I
rule,
assume that's the exception.
yeah, I think, well,
Yeah.
and I think he was the exception in a
Um,
number of ways as a guest editor.
yeah.
Yeah, no, he definitely
But
gets ecstatic about poems in a way that feels like, even Nabokov's like jokey Superman poem, he gets like
yeah.
real worked up about it. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know, I'm not sure that quite
Yeah.
deserves the excitement.
Yeah, but and then Zapruder uses all these words like liberated and
Yeah,
dangerous and
yeah,
ruthlessly accurate. It's this. It's
yeah.
you can just like it. It's
Right.
okay if you just like it.
Yeah. This
You
isn't the
don't
French
have to pretend
Resistance.
it's
Yeah.
yeah or the American one.
Right. Oh, I mean, he does talk about resisting and resistance.
Yes,
Yeah. Can we?
yes.
So what? Because you, as you say, he gets to this point, where he says it a couple times. After having read these poems, he says, "Now I feel alive and aware. I feel sadder, more vulnerable, and more capable of resisting." As you said, just resisting,
Mhm.
resisting. Period. And then earlier he
Yes.
says something as well about, he says something, he uses resistance elsewhere in
Mhm.
this
Yes, he
essay.
does. The first time he does it, at least the first time I remember, he does it in a way that's like even broader in its implications. The poetic imagination, he
Yeah.
says, which I'm already off the
Right.
boat when you
Yeah.
start talking about the poetic imagination. Poetic imagination connects concretely with activism, resistance, and optimism,
Why?
which
Why
is
is
like
that true? What does that
yeah,
mean, and why
like
would it be true?
and then he gets back to it again. A few pages later, he says, despite all the efforts to control it, poetry has from the beginning never bent to authority, which is
Never. Never.
bullshit.
Hasn't it frequently
Bullshit.
bent to authority? Hasn't this
I
happened
mean,
all the time?
what is the job of the poet laureate in England? It's to
Right.
bend to authority. It's like,
Corporate pop music. I mean, yeah, court poets throughout history. Like,
yeah,
Virgil, wasn't Virgil bending to authority with one of the great poems? Like,
yeah,
doesn't poetry constantly bends to authority? Like, it's
yes,
absurd. It's an absurd. I mean, that's such a weird claim to say. Like, authority can, you could say like authority has never been able to totally define poetry, or has never stifled, but like has never, poetry's never bent to authority. Like what does
Yeah,
that
well,
mean?
what's the dynasty in China too, where part of becoming a bureaucrat or courtier was that you had to pass this poetry writing test.
Right.
It like
I mean,
unless you come up
for that
with
matter,
another one of these.
fucking the SATs and the GRSCW, whatever the fuck the English people talk. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
no, I mean, poetry bends to authority nonstop, and he does. I mean, it does seem like he make this is where he dithers, and he both sides. I mean, he doesn't both sides it in a political sense, but he goes back and forth, trying not to make statements about poetry while using the most superlative language possible. But he
yes.
does make a few of these weird claims. What do you make of the resisting thing specifically? Like, is this just
So
hashtag resistance? Like, is it just
I,
picking up
yeah,
that word?
I think that's where he's getting the word from. Yes, absolutely.
Because what could that possibly
Uh,
mean? Like, what could that practically in application mean?
well, here's how he gets to it. This point you talked about where he kind of does this faux denigration of poetry, which
Yeah.
is really just setting up his exaltation of it. He kind of says, "Oh, I worried that poetry wasn't the right thing in the midst of all of this horror in the world." Which is, a perfectly valid thing to worry about. It's a perfectly thing to worry about, at least.
I do feel like
Um,
that can be, again, with maybe the exception of Dana Gioia, like, is there a year in recent memory when someone could not have written that in the intro?
I think the past 4 or 5 years have been
Yeah, yeah.
ones where, um, for a lot of liberals and lefties,
Yeah,
and
and
I'm,
since Trump's election,
but
certainly, and then the
yeah,
pandemic.
exactly. Where the whether I mean, certainly all these urgencies were there before, but like they're just they've just been much more visible and like much more guilt inducing for a lot of white liberals and lefties. And so I think he feels implicated by that, and he kind of catches himself coming and going with that. But that's then he then turns it around, not to say just, okay, well, I wondered how much poetry was worth when I see people being killed by the police, and an entire religion being barred from the doors of America. But instead, no, in fact, it turns out that poetry is the answer. He's here to defend poetry. He kind of puts on this air of being somebody who isn't sure what all of this is worth, but then he's going to turn it on its head, and he's going to say, no, 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 this is actually the key. So, I was curious. I went back before we recorded, and I read both Sidney and Shelley's defenses of poetry,
Hmm.
and whoa. But like, but both of them begin from this perceived insult to poetry,
Yeah.
which is, I think, in a sense, what Zapruder is doing here as well.
It's been a while since I've read
And then
Shelley's,
they,
but I read Sydney's recently. Yeah.
yeah, and then they both end up. The only way they can answer it is to say poetry is better than everything.
Right. That's such a
Like
weird impulse.
it's, I can't
Like
remember if it's
Sydney
Sidney or
spends so
Shelley.
much energy saying like it's so much better than philosophy. Fuck philosophy.
Yeah.
Poetry. Like, why
Well,
is what? Why are we
is
doing
it is
this?
it is it Sidney or Shelley who's like, and actually Jesus was a poet. Um,
Oh God, I can't remember. But yeah, he does have a number
yeah,
of absurd proofs of poetry's superiority to
yeah.
all other human endeavors.
And so I guess there's this just weird tradition in the history of English poetry, and both of them are extremely moralizing in their case of poetry. The case
Yeah.
for
Oh yeah. Yeah. Super.
poetry leads to moral good.
Right.
um,
Which like
and so
just seems
it's
absurd.
like if you prick poetry, it doesn't bleed. It just like turns into this massive chauvinist. There's this kind of milky quality to the whole thing, where he wants to be just kind of super gentle and welcoming. He starts out by writing to this imagined reader who doesn't really like poetry but has picked up this book. But he loses track of that person pretty
Oh man, that
fast.
person is nowhere to be. If you're reading this and don't read much poetry or feel uncertain in relation to it, you're more than welcome here. Well, you're not welcome in like paragraph 5 or like this
When
introduction.
I tell
Like,
you how poets are so much superior to everybody else on earth because like
right.
they're the only people who ask big questions, or no, that's not fair. He says says, in poetry, unlike so much of the rest of life, people are asking the big questions, which is kind of fuck you. Like,
Yeah, like
people are
what does
asking,
that mean? Like
and then
first,
he,
like they're often not asking big questions of poetry, and they often are
right,
asking them elsewhere. So what does that?
yeah,
Why? What does
yeah,
that mean?
exactly. And then he gets so carried away. Oh yeah, so these are dire times, he says. This is the top of this. Often the question occurred to me reading these poems: what am I doing? Certain poems reminded me that there was possibility in language and thought. Great. Which gave me some hope. Also great. Yet I often felt convinced that none of this literary activity was going to make the slightest difference. Perfectly human response.
Sure.
And then he gets into this crazy discussion about dreaming,
Oh
where
man.
he connects poetry to
Oh
dreaming. He says
man.
all this wild stuff about dreaming, where dreaming is the one place where one is free to imagine anything. And he starts talking about the surrealist saw dreams as
Oh
essential to
god.
ending
It's
war and
so.
to improving
Oh
the human
man.
condition. And then he kind of has to double back and be like, well, that didn't really work. But
Right.
he
And then
seems to
we had
suggest, well,
World
that
War
didn't,
II.
yeah. But he kind of suggests, well, that was just because not enough people became surrealists. Like he
We weren't
really
dreaming
seems to
hard
suggest
enough.
if Hitler had been a surrealist, we would have all been fine.
Yeah, no,
um,
it is. I mean, it is like,
and
yeah,
then,
it's
but hold
almost
on,
like he
so
didn't
then,
know how that ended. It's like he was reading a history book when he was writing that paragraph. And we were like, oh no, the Holocaust. Like, that didn't work out so well.
but then he gets so carried away with this. He says, but the surrealists were not wrong that dreaming is at least a step toward change. A poem is a dream made manifest in the world for oneself and others.
Wow.
Before we dismiss dreams as a source of knowledge and power and change, we should remember that Dr. Martin Luther King
Oh my
Jr.
God.
did not say he had a thought or plan or an idea. It's like, oh
I
my
mean,
God.
I feel like
Oh my
the
God.
invocation of the
Leave.
"I have a dream" speech is the like Godwin's law of like poetry introductions, where like if you keep writing one long enough, eventually you will find yourself invoking that speech, and at that point you realize like, oh, I'm not saying anything of value anymore. No, it's such a it's so batty, and then I mean
And
he goes
that's,
on to like when he finally starts talking about the poems of the book, he doesn't recommend them. I mean, he says the imagination of these poets took me again and again to places where I could feel again, though not in the usual ways. Often the poems painfully reminded me that everything is alive. First, like I have no idea what that means. And then as he starts giving examples, it makes less sense. A bulldozer lowers its bucket in the rain. Is anything alive in that sentence? Like, is there anything that's alive in that sentence in any sense? When a goldfish dies, we mourn the entire ocean. Do we? A bolt of lightning falls in love. Our love,
yeah,
like
I
our
mean,
grief, is like all right, it's unreasoned, but like, what is this? What? Who are
it
you? What are you
it
selling
really
here?
sometimes feels like this is just like a first draft. You got really excited at certain points writing this first draft. Like this is one of those things where it makes me wonder, like, does anybody edit anything? Because some
No.
of these things, like any good friend would be like, dude, leave Martin Luther King alone. He's got more
Oh my
important things
god.
to do.
Right.
Um,
No.
like it's just, and so much of this is just like
The next
it's
sentence.
just untrue.
The poems I love most are responsible to others and the world,
Mhm.
but also feel free. What are you talking? What meaning?
Yeah,
What in what's like how
yeah.
what? How could any of those terms actually apply in any kind of restrictive, meaningful sense? In William Logan's most recent review, Omnibus, he cites a truly like painful misspelling in Ted Kuzer's new book, and then he says the copy editor should be fired, and it was like. Copy editor? Like, who do you think is working on this? Like, there's no copy editor. And I think you're right. I think like no, can you imagine with the gritted teeth with which David Lehman wrote his introduction? Can you imagine him like giving notes to Zapruder on this introduction? I mean,
I assume he didn't.
no, no.
I just assume he
That's what I'm
didn't.
saying. Is like I'm sure he was like, I'm just gonna
Yeah,
let you, yeah, go wild, man.
yeah.
Oh, I wanted to ask you what you thought of this because it's offhand, but it's not like you could have written this sentence in a way that doesn't make the claim he makes. And I
Hmm.
feel like it might seem unfair to hold him to it, but like he is making a claim here. When he says, as I was reading through all the magazines and websites in 2021, I did not have. You could just say, as I read through many, many websites, as I read through websites and magazines in 2021, as I read through all the websites and magazines in 2021, even if we just restrict that to like just like the ones that publish poetry, even the ones that publish poetry of like pick a degree of note, and I guarantee you he still didn't read all of those. It's like, what a
Hmm.
weird, like, why make that claim?
Yeah, again,
Because like almost every other introduction of these I've heard makes the point of saying like, you can't read all the poems. Nobody
mhm.
reads all the poems.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, it's
Um,
just such a weird note to throw in.
yeah, he just gets so carried away, and it's such a weird combination because there is just terrible milky qualities so often where he's trying so hard to be gentle,
I
but
found myself
it's
just
just like this
like
reduced
stopping
fat
and rereading
introduction.
paragraphs again and again because they're just a wash of abstract nouns. They just like it's so hard to get any kind of footing on any of this.
I mean, at one point he gets so carried away that he basically described what's his like a rapid response team for contemporary events. He explains that because
Oh
you
God.
can write a
Oh
poem really
no.
fast,
Fuck.
and because poets have this special quality of not understanding what they're saying, they're the
Poets are
perfect people
specialists in
for
the unknown, and
responding
because
to
of the
confusing.
compactness of a poem and its flexibility, can respond rapidly to any
Yeah,
situation.
yeah,
Can they? Like I would think,
yeah.
like there are people who like rapid responders. Like that is a real category,
they're
but that's
they're
not the
they're
category we're talking about.
they're armed Nazis showing up in our town. Call the poets.
Right? They can respond rapidly, not helpfully, but rapidly. No, I mean it's so bizarre. He says this like really gave me pause. He's talking about reading poems from different people of different backgrounds and experiences and so forth. He
Mhm.
says poems remind us that at our core we share something deep. This is the gorgeous paradox of poetry. Again, like totally inarguable, very, very familiar kind of broad statement about poetry, but like, fine, right. And then he says, it's as if there are human qualities that link us across
Why that
time and
as if?
geographical and other differences.
Yes.
And
Why
then he
as
says,
if?
perhaps this is ultimately a fiction. What is
Yeah.
what?
Does nothing to explain why he thinks like
What?
human beings are just completely atomized
We don't have
creatures
qualities that link us across time and space? Like, what do you
yeah,
think? Do you think like they're different kinds of people who live on different continents? Like what? What? And then that I mean, I was
yeah.
thinking when I the first time I read that sentence, I thought it was a winking sort of like Groucho Marx joke, like it's as if
Mhm.
we have qualities in common. But then he go like that. Perhaps
No.
this is ultimately a fiction. That's him being responsible and saying like, well, let me be the grown up in the
Mhm.
room and remind us like we probably shouldn't believe that we have qualities in common.
Well, yeah, it almost felt like he just
Like he
he
started to
there
feel
was this
himself saying
one
something and he had to backpedal.
or there's this one guy he sees on Facebook who's like the kind of cultural relativist that other cultural relativists don't even really want to associate with,
Right,
but who like always puts in a comment on his Facebook post, and he was like, "Oh well, that could, yeah," like
right,
it
yeah,
just felt
yeah.
like
Like the
he had to
belief in
defer to this
universality
person,
of experience is colonialism or something.
and so he just had to like instinctively defer to that one person.
I don't
Yeah.
I feel sort of bad for him because he doesn't and he cites three poems that are in the book. He
Hmm.
doesn't even quote from Vivi Francis's. He just talks about
No.
how it does the abstract things it does very well. He
Right.
quotes a little bit from Jericho Brown's inaugural, which
Hmm.
I believe that was I believe he published that, and that was on the back of the New York Times Magazine, and on the front of that edition was Claudia Rankine also writing like
Okay.
a made to order poem, like in the early stretch of
Hmm.
the pandemic. And I remember the Jericho Brown poem being like remarkably good for being written on
Yeah.
short notice. And I thought like, oh, this sort of captures something, and it feels like I can connect to this. The Claudia Rankine poem that went with it was terrible, but I thought like it was a fine poem, and like probably if you're gonna do best American poetry, part of what you're doing is you're writing, you're responding to what people are writing right now. So like he quotes a little bit from that poem that seems like, okay, there's something valuable. He just tells us to like take it on faith that Vivi Francis's poem does this elaborate metaphysical task he
Hmm.
does. And then he quotes, and I feel bad for this poet Jalen Harris, but he quotes this really unimpressive section from this poem, and then his meditation on it is only worse. She says,
Yeah.
how deep in love I am, and how silly of me to spend all morning daydreaming about love and not expect my desire to set me free. I don't understand how that makes any sense. Not expect my desire. How do I spend all day daydreaming about love and not expect my desire to set me free? I have no idea what that means. Then she goes on to say, the knives of my fingers tap out the notion that if I turn the key, it will unlock. I mean, I am confused, but like, I like the knives of my fingers feels like that's not great, and it doesn't particularly ring true, and I don't know what it's getting at. But then his response to that is, would you imagine your knives are fingers? Your fingers are knives, especially in the moment of typing a poem about love? I would not. Now I will not forget it. What?
Yeah. Well, okay. So a couple of things.
Am I missing
I
something?
do think the poem tracks. I can follow, or the excerpt tracks. I can follow its logic. But yeah, like, and it's that same thing he's doing with the you. There's something like simultaneously condescending and
That sounds like he's talking to an elementary school
vain.
class.
Yeah, like he's like he's trying to talk in a way that's welcoming, and it just feels so condescending. Like, why can't you say won't?
And then
And then and
he tags that with that is the rebellious spirit by which poets are animated. Again, like this
yeah,
weird poet
mhm,
essentialism about
mhm.
like the
Right.
different species that is poets.
And again, like, this constant, so that he writes at one point after talking about the Brown poem as being ruthlessly accurate. I like the Brown poem. I wouldn't read the rest of it. I liked it,
Yeah,
but
no, I
it's
think
not
like
ruthless.
that like
It's
it's not
artful. It's
ruthlessly.
good.
It's yeah, it seems
Um,
it's very like humane and
and
like
but
welcoming.
then
It's a very
and
gentle
then
poem.
he can't stop himself. He says, "Only a poem, it seems to me, only a poem is capable of expressing and creating in the mind of the reader the coexisting, colliding, disappointing, irresolvable mess of despair, rage, and foolish hope that defines what it is to be American." So, like,
I don't know, man. Like,
why
what
does
about a
only
good
like
song or a
do,
movie or
yeah?
like an
What about,
essay
yeah?
or a
Exactly. Like, why
documentary
why
or
why do we have to why do we have to win?
and
Like,
what is and yeah, what
it's
is the like? There's something about America specifically that like boy, it's good. It's a good thing we had poetry when America came along because otherwise nothing would
yeah.
capture it.
I lived in New York when 9/11 happened. And I remember going around with friends afterwards. And in New York, there would just be all these little newspaper boxes with these tiny specialty newspapers, like,
Yeah, yeah,
Cheesemakers Weekly or whatever it was.
yeah, yeah.
Because it's a big enough city that, like, even all of those could have like a free
Right.
paper
Yeah.
of their own. And like after 9/11, all of them, their headline were like, three cheese aficionados die in terrorist attacks on 9/11. Like, they all like they knew they
Yeah.
were still a cheese magazine,
Right.
but
They couldn't
there was
not
this other
address
story.
9/11. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of this kind of feels like that. It's like, because he in white poetry, he's very skeptical of political poetry. He
Hmm.
thinks it's like, he treats it as antithetical to what he believes poetry is,
Yeah.
which is this thing that foregrounds the uncertainty of language above all else, and everything. And then here he's like, well, yes, politics matter. So, now we plug in poetry over here. The other thing it made me think of is, like, when the Nobel Committee gave Dylan the Nobel Prize, which I don't care. Like, it doesn't
Yeah.
bother me,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Whatever. Yeah.
it just felt like such a desperate gesture. It was like
Yeah.
they took this like flashlight they had and like tried to point it at this massive spotlight. And they're
Right.
like, "Look, we gave Bob Dylan $1 million."
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's just something kind of
Yeah.
desperate about all this.
Like
Like,
they like the Nobel Committee seems like a big deal until they give a prize to Bob Dylan, and then you realize
yeah,
how puny they
exactly.
are.
Bob Dylan's like, "I'm sorry, I have lunch plans that week."
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
And I will say, like, I don't know if you want to get into this, but I think one place where you and I disagree is that I see a lot more value in political poetry, I think, than you do.
Maybe like I see very little value in political poetry. There are political poems that have value, but
Yeah.
like as a concept, I think it's a highly unconvincing concept and a highly like shaky theory. And then sometimes individual poems do amazing things.
What's the theory?
If you're writing a poem about
Hmm.
the human experience of politics, well, that's like
Hmm.
writing about any human experience, right? And so you can write good things about, you can write like moving, interesting, memorable, funny, insightful things about working in a factory, about having a family, about doing any number of kinds of jobs, about, and certainly you can write them about being involved in politics or experiencing politics the way we do. But that's not what people typically mean when they say political poetry. I don't think they typically mean a poem about the experience of walking up to City Hall to vote and talking to somebody there. And like I was interviewed by a UNC student who asked me some funny questions after I voted. And like that was I could write a poem about that if I wanted to, and that would be a thing. But that's not what people mean when they say political poetry. And I think when people talk about the urgency of political poetry, the importance. I mean, he says this again and again. He says the greatest poems demand change. False. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. No.
Yeah.
And he says, like all lyrics that seem true to me, they speak against power with anger or passion or despair, or sometimes with an exhilarating disinterest in what they is usually considered important. They seem written against in order to
Hmm.
preserve. Why? I mean, like some poems
Right.
are, sure.
Yeah.
But the idea that that's the essence of poetry, or the idea that like there's some important responsibility for us to write poems that will do something political, because that's what I think people tend to mean when they say political poetry, that will achieve a political end.
Yeah.
Then I want I want to like show me the math, like what, how, where, because the individual
Yeah.
poems can have an effect, and great, wonderful, who knows what
Hmm.
effect an individual poem will have,
Right.
but what's the theory behind it? What's the call to arms? What's the demand?
Yeah. So my sense is that what you object to is not political poems, including poems that advocate for political change, that are intended to make some difference in the political world, so much as the expectation that people should write them, or the sense that they are morally superior acts to writing other kinds of poems. Is
I
that
do, I do, I do uh, disagree with the claim that people ought to write political poems, or that writing political poems is morally superior, or morally imperative. I also, though, find that almost all of the time when I read a poem that clearly has designs on me,
Mhm.
I it doesn't it's not a very good poem.
As opposed to most of the other kinds of poems you read?
Well, that have just like, sorry, that are trying to get me to go perform a political act. That are like
Mhm.
poems that are political rhetoric. I mean,
Mhm.
first of all, in most cases, they're not even trying to get you to perform a political act. They're trying
Right.
to, they're pep talks. They're like,
Sure.
they're poems for rallies, for like
Hmm.
they're
Yeah.
absolutely, they're so deeply preaching to the choir that we need another metaphor for what they're doing, because it's so inert. Even if they were going to do a good job of what they're doing, which they don't, what is it they want to do?
I don't think rallying people towards a cause, like, and again, like everything can be done badly, and most kinds of poems are done badly most of the time. But I don't think rallying people towards a cause, I don't think making people feel less lonely in a pursuit of justice that seems to never progress and never end.
Oh, but
I
but
don't.
political poems make me feel more lonely. Political poems make me feel more like I'm not talking to a human being. I'm talking to a talking point. I'm talking to a commercial. I think like I love a malediction. Like I love a good
Mhm.
malediction. But
Yeah.
part of what makes a malediction really good, in my experience, for the most part, is that it captures the experience of rage. It
Hmm.
captures the
Yeah.
feeling that we have felt many times. Most political poems that are angry don't do that.
Right.
They just wag a finger and sneer at the bad guy.
Right.
And like I
Yeah.
also dislike that bad guy, but they're not actually
Hmm.
doing any good lyric work. They're not actually ringing true, or striking a nerve, or reminding me of like, oh god,
Hmm.
I felt that too. Instead I just think like, yeah, I also think that guy sucks. It just, to me, like I don't,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like they're doing very much. But they are acting as if they are doing the most important thing in the world. And like
Right.
both ends of that annoy
Mhm.
me.
Sure. Um, but again, like I think that's more a function of being done badly or being than it is about the inherent nature of writing a poem with political objective in mind.
Like what kind of political objective would a poem have in mind today that would be?
Stick with Jericho Brown. There's a poem of his that I wrote about in my book called Bullet Points.
Yeah.
It is, I think, a very effective political poem, not because it stopped what it's lamenting and protesting against, which is black men being killed by police for doing nothing wrong, or for doing nothing of consequence wrong, in the way he frames it in the poem.
Is it? I just want to see. Why don't I just read it? Because it's not that long.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So in case people don't know it.
please. Hmm.
Because yeah, this certainly was one I read and responded to, and it, yeah, I think it got some circulation, but it's worth reading. This is Bullet Points by Jericho Brown. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back. And I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you. Cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain. That's Bullet Points by Jericho Brown.
I mean, I think that poem is doing more than just making a political case, but I think it's making a political case. I think it's a poem of protest.
Yeah, I, it is. It's certainly and obviously responding to current events, and it clearly expresses a feeling about those events and a perspective. But I think what's most effective about it, and what distinguishes it from plenty of other poems about the same subject, is that it's like a sail that effectively captures the wind of fury and anger and
Mhm.
sadness. Like it
Sure.
catches hold of a feeling that one can relate to and one can imagine. Like it
And you
rings
would,
true as a
yeah,
cry of anger and despair and
and
protest.
you would say that about some successful political speech as well, right?
Sure, yeah. So like some political speeches can also have a lyric element. Yeah, that can
Hmm.
definitely be an effective
And
element.
generally speaking, the ones that are successful are going to do something. Well, all of them that are successful are going to do something that touches people, that moves people.
Yeah, I think most political speeches though don't achieve much political end. I think mostly
Right.
what political speeches do today is they make us feel warm feelings toward the person who's speaking them.
Sure.
So if Jericho Brown were running for office, then this would be no, I mean I'm serious. Like this would be effective at making me think like, oh, I feel something. I feel some belief in this guy or some connection with this guy or like like this makes me feel closer to him, and I certainly it makes me. I mean, it doesn't change the way I feel about the conditions he's writing about, but it certainly puts me in mind of them. I don't know what political like this is a poem about political circumstances, and it is a powerful poem. If I have to get down to brass tacks, though, like what political effect is it having?
Not much, like almost all other political acts, like me voting, like me showing up for a march. Almost any political act an individual in this country can engage in, short of entering into office, is likely to have at most a minuscule impact. Um,
Yeah,
my donation to a political candidate,
right.
whatever it's going to be, those are all at best going to have a minuscule impact. But I do think this is a poem that makes this issue, at least briefly, more salient for me than other political issues that could be capturing my
Sure.
outrage or despair
Yeah.
or you know potential to act. I do think that I've been doing some work with a woman who is a full time racial justice advocate,
Yeah.
who I really admire. And one of the things that she always says is like, we we're not the first people to care about racism. We're not the first people to try and stop racism. Like,
Sure.
people have been doing this for a long time, and it's still there. So you have you have to sustain people in that.
Right.
You have to allow people to keep going. So I think all of those are meaningful. I don't think any of those by themselves are going to make a single dent in police violence or in racial injustice, but neither is any one person who shows up for a march or goes out to vote.
Yeah. I mean, I think for one thing, like voting and donating to political causes certainly can feel quite futile and often statistically hard, but there is still like a measurable function. There is a thing happening there.
Mm-hmm.
Like with a march, it's a little more nebulous. With a poem, it's more nebulous still. But also, I mean, maybe this is less of an aesthetic point, more of a political one. But it just seems to me like the problem with American politics right now is not that we need more awareness raising, but it feels
Mm-hmm.
like that's all we fucking do is awareness raise. Like we're in a way
Mm-hmm.
like part of our problem is that we are hyper aware of certain things in a way that becomes disproportionate to their actual like we're hyper aware of street crime in a way that
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't
Right.
actually correspond to its frequency.
Right.
Like we're hyper aware, and I think like our awareness of things is not that's not our weakness. And I think there's I mean awareness raising often, as plenty of other people have pointed out, becomes an end in itself. So I don't say any of this to criticize the poem, but I do say it, I guess, to say, like what I often hear when people are really worked up about a political problem and they are poets or they care about poetry. What I often
Mm-hmm.
hear is yeah, but what about this? And I think my response is like, well, it sounds like you really care about this. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're going to write poems, you should write them about things you really care about. So
Yeah.
like do that. But like what doesn't seem true to me is like the house is on fire. Let's go grab a bucket full of poems and put it out. Like, well, no. Like, come on, man.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't that the solution to our problems is people writing more political poems. I don't know how we're going to solve any of these problems either. So,
Yeah.
if people want to try them, I think they can produce something worthwhile as much as any other
Yeah.
kind of poetic attempt. And again, like it's only when people start acting as if like this is the kind of poem everybody should be writing, or this is a morally superior act to other kinds of writing.
Yeah. Which
You know,
boy
I
he
mean,
really does
there are
need
kinds of
to.
political action that are morally superior.
Often because they involve real risk and real
Yeah,
sacrifice. And
exactly. Yeah,
unlike
exactly.
unlike writing poems. Like at least in this
Yeah,
country at this moment,
in
you're not
in
actually
spite
risking
of
anything
both
by writing a poem.
in spite of both layman and Zapruder using words like daring and
Yeah, no.
whatever else
There's
they're saying.
Louise Gluck has a very good essay about what it means to be brave as a poet, and generally it
Yeah,
means not living in this country.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. In the direst
Um,
circumstances, poems are available to everyone and can help us resist and survive and see and forgive each other. There's the last resist there. See and forgive each other and ourselves. I feel like he was like, he also like, he was like getting so exhausted by the end there. He was like, and ourselves. And I want to be absolved of writing this essay. I want to be done. Like, forgive me, Father, for I have written this introduction to Best American Poetry 2022. Poor Matthew
um,
Zapruder. Did you want to talk
yeah,
about the Hottest and Salter poems?
not just those, but those were two examples. So there are excerpts in here from poems by
This is
Rachel Hoddes
Yeah, and this is
and
Lehman's
Mary Jo Salter,
forward.
both of which,
Yeah,
yeah,
In
certainly.
Lehman's forward, not in
Um,
Zapruder's. Yeah, he quotes these two poems.
yeah, yes. Um, and then from a poem by somebody named Terrence Wench, who I don't know about,
Yeah, I know
and then
one poem of
other
his from
poems
way
that fit
back.
into this in other ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Terry Ellen Cross Davis
but
and Angela Ball as well. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Terrence Winch, I believe,
but
has been in Best American Poetry in the past. I'm not sure.
pretty much all of the poems that Layman includes feel a little bit like light verse to me. Like I feel like that's one of the things he wants something that's like one of his objections, I think, to Zapruder selections
Yeah,
is that he wants something that's kind of more like an old tin can alley kind of thing. He wants something that's poppy and catchy,
yeah, yeah.
um, kind of playing with pop culture and high culture and all these things.
I mean,
All three
I
of
mean, to that end, yeah, I'll
these,
say the other, in addition to reading these two, like, because I bought this morning, and in addition to reading the forward and the introduction a couple times and getting ready for this, I like, I can go ahead and read 75 pages of
Mhm.
poetry. No, it's 175 pages of poems. Like these
Yeah,
are fucking
yeah,
long poems. Like only one quarter of
yeah,
these poems are just one pagers, and like half of
yeah.
those are enormous blocks of prose poetry that have like just crushing word counts. So I totally lost all momentum when I started to pick that up.
And I'll just a quick nod to our previous conversation. Of the few poems in it that I've read so far, just starting from the beginning, my favorite so far is actually the first one,
Mm,
which is also a political poem by Aria Aber, called
mm,
America, that very much I think playing with um, Allen Ginsberg's America, which
mm.
also, like America and putting my queer shoulder to the wheel, like that's some pretty lively poetry.
Yeah.
That keeps pretty well. So these three poems, and I don't really know Mary Jo Salter's poems. I don't know this Terrence much. I've read a decent amount of Rachel Hoddes and have liked a lot of what I've read of hers. But all these have this quality that I feel like I see in a lot of contemporary formal poetry,
Hmm.
which is like something that feels a little clever, but also like a little self-satisfied, just like taking some concepts out for a spin. Like at times, some of these things remind me of like the poetry version of what's that? Wait, wait, don't tell me, that NPR
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
show.
yeah, yeah.
Like, is that familiar? Like, is that in
Yeah,
fact familiar to you? Is that something that?
it is. I mean, so like the Terrence Winch, I don't know it as well. I didn't read that whole poem. I just saw his little excerpts from it, and that's also in. It plays with rhyme a little bit, but it's in free verse basically. The Hoddes and the Salter are both. They're about Zoom and about the experience of sort of being stuck on Zoom, and
Yeah.
I think like they're both. So the Salter poem is substantially longer than what he quotes,
Okay.
and there are sections of it that I think are stronger, including she has
Hmm.
a passage about Randall Keenan's funeral on Zoom, and then the closing is actually interesting because it sort of projects to an imagined future, which is not as we have not even as cleanly achieved today, which is one where we're not doing this anymore. But they both suffer a little bit from the problem of writing about Zoom, which I just think is not. I think it's hard to write anything about Zoom. I think there may be a generational thing where like it being stuck on a computer in that particular way was slightly more novel to people our parents' age. I think everything in them rings true, and I think like it's well
Yeah.
put, and I believe it, and I recognize it. But I just like I was so instantly bored of Zoom the second I learned about it that I just don't think I just don't think it's a subject with legs. So it was like it
Yeah.
was curious for me to me that like he plucked those two and really was excited about them in particular.
Yeah.
I mean that's also
There's
like a
there,
terrific book that Mary Jo that poem is from, and it's got
which I haven't read. Yeah.
yeah, and it's got like I mean that is I think that's a very accomplished if not outstanding poem, but like there's some really great poems in that book that did come
Okay.
out in that same year. But yeah,
So,
Sorry, but you were
to
talking about
round it all away. Yeah.
the light verse thing. Yeah, I
Yeah.
do think that's. I think part of it may be a risk in intrinsic to form, particularly when people aren't as used to it, because it is so obvious that you're having to calculate it. And so I think
Yeah.
like you have to work really hard not to sound cute or pat. I think when you're
Mhm.
doing it.
That's true, and I think too. There's this larger thing. This is not at all specific to formal poetry. It's something I'm more aware of happening in free verse. But there are all these poems that I would read when I was getting all these books and actually looking at them and everything, where it felt like the person so believed in the value of poetry or so believed in the value of them writing poems and publishing poems that like they were just looking for an occasion to write a poem. And so they
Yeah,
were
yeah,
kind of these occasional poems, but they didn't really serve the function of an occasional poem. Oftentimes it was like, oh, this is a poem that's the result of a prompt and you haven't even taken the scaffolding off of it.
yes,
And a version of that I feel like I see sometimes in a decent number of the formal poems I come across.
hmm
And I know you're a huge A. Stallings fan. I've read poems of
yeah.
hers that I've really
Oh,
liked,
I
but
just
some of
read
her
her
poems,
selected. She does it a lot. She does it a lot. Yeah.
yeah, it feels like it feels almost like someone's been assigned a theme, like,
Yeah.
write a poem, and then you have this person who's kind of witty and they can do some clever enough things, but it's like, oh, this just the stakes feel really low, and also like the formulations feel like they're things that sound almost like something funny. Like poem has these lines: "For the soul in each black square, were there really people there?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
the Pope thing about what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed.
Like
Like
what
that's
ne'er
actually
was
something
thought,
that
but yeah.
no, that's something that oft was thought and was said in almost exactly those
Right.
terms by,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I mean, like every teacher I know who taught on Zoom
Yeah. Well, and I think
said
that's part
something
of it.
that sounds like were there really people
All of
there.
the observations are true, but none of them are novel.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
not novel in meaning, and not novel in expression. I don't buy the idea that you have to say something new. I really do believe that Pope formulation, but
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and that was funny because
like,
there was a moment in is it like the funny little section he chose in Mary Jo's poem was not, I think, the strongest section of it. And in the hottest poem, similarly, there was a moment earlier where she's talking about the words her students don't know, and then she has this moment where she starts to focus in on it, and then she steps back and says, "Oh, what does she say exactly? It's not like a remarkable line, but she says, thinking too hard though doesn't do."
mhm,
She corrects herself by saying like the more you think about it, the harder it gets, and it's just like it's a
mhm.
funny little like very accurate, familiar human moment
Yeah,
that felt like the poem just relaxed a little bit.
yeah,
And
I
yeah,
like that.
I think what you're saying is very true. I think it is something that a lot of poets do
Hmm.
with Stallings. She will often pick like a quotidian object, and then she's just
Hmm.
a master of reusing and like repurposing cliches and platitudes in a way that opens them up. And like she's brilliant with puns and brilliant with like
Hmm.
conversational speech and using it in a way that is like clever and new, but is sort of ultimately a lot of those examples they're perfectly made and they are perfect versions of themselves, but the occasion is just not significant. Like it just doesn't add up to enough. In some cases, they like she has one called Disdain where I think like it transcends its subject a little bit, but then others
Hmm.
like Pencil or Scissors, you think like, all right, well, this is like very well done. But I
Hmm.
think the difference between when she does it or when because Mary Jo I think has a similar impulse and Wilbur at times would even do that, though his weakness was
Hmm.
riddles more often. I think what happens when a formal poet of some skill does it is that it's really really obvious and it's also really crisp and
Hmm.
clear what the occasion is. Whereas I think
Hmm.
similarly like with like poetry criticism, the easiest way to start an argument in poetry criticism is to say something clear, to make a statement that is like distinctively and inarguably a statement about poetry, about like, or even
Hmm.
about a poet or a poem. Like it's part of what William Logan gets in trouble for because often like he's not all. Even like even in his most recent omnibus, he's not he's not the best critic, but he's also I mean, a lot of he praises poetry often. Often his praise is mushier than his harsh criticism, but it's part of what I think people object to is that it's very clear what he's saying, and I think in so much poetry criticism and in so many poems, there's just a kind of a wash of sentiment. Or a wash of like abstraction. I mean, for criticism, it's a wash of abstraction. For poetry, it's often a wash of feelings and trivial details. But I think with formal poetry, it's easier to tell what you're going for, and the boring, pointless, quotidian, occasional poem is another example of that larger principle.
I won't argue with you about Logan here. We can do that some other time.
Sure, sure.
Uh, but yeah, and I think the other
He
thing.
did something in his most recent which I appreciated, which was he was really hard on two older poets, but then he also said like here's how they could be a little bit like here's how they are at their best. And like
Mhm.
here's what I really want from them, which like argue with them or not, it was like it was nice to see that rather than just him riffing.
Yeah. Um, but the other thing I'll say with a lot of criticism too is that, another thing that really stood out for me going back to Sydney and Shelley is like just how threatened and jealous they are of other disciplines.
Oh man.
And I feel like, I feel like the humanities in general right now, but maybe literature more than some, is just so jealous of other disciplines. Like it just wants so much academic writing
Yeah.
is like fake science, which is just to say bureaucracy. And I feel like it's there in the Zapruder as well. Like there's just hunger to have what somebody else has, this desire to plug into um, somebody else's authority or renown, and to use to justify this thing that you're doing.
Do you,
Um,
do you connect those impulses? Because I know I do, and probably to some extent unfairly, between poets who are really hell bent on poetry being important and having an impact on the world, and academics who are really committed to this idea that academic literary criticism is like gonna bring justice to the world and like spur the revolution in this way that feels just they both feel to me sort of futile and annoyingly self-important.
yeah.
And like beside the
Yes.
point, like there is a better thing to be doing than this dumb
Mhm.
pointless thing.
Right.
Good. All right, well that
Yes.
was easy. That was this week's show. You should look out for Jonathan. He has been working for the last few years on a kind of amazing giant historical poetry research project. I won't say any more than that, but it is. I've read at least a partial draft, and it's really fucking cool. So that will eventually be emerging into the light. You should keep an eye out for that. Also, I totally forgot to mention, Jonathan did an interview with me very generously a couple months ago, and it just recently came out on the Seawall. It's like a fun conversation. I don't even remember all of the details of it because it was so long ago. But they're I think they're Jonathan and maybe the guy Ron Slate, Jenny Slate's dad, who runs the magazine. He I think has a brief comment, and then there's some poems on there as well as just like a big rambling conversation that we had. That uh, I was surprised to hear even Ryan enjoyed it. Ryan is usually way too highbrow for the kinds of down in the filth conversations that Jonathan and I have about poetry. But Ryan enjoyed it, and maybe you will too. I will include a link to that in the show notes. Thank you to Jonathan as always. I do hope to get him back on soon. You can reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.